Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Today we're starting a lecture series on one of the most famous Christians that Scotland has ever known. And that man is Columba of Iona, lived probably 521 to 597. And his journey over the next 7 weeks will take us into faith, into history, even into politics and spirituality. In this first lecture of the series, we're going to try and set the scene. And we're going to look at Christian faith in Scotland before Columba, and therefore leading up to Columba and the context that he came to. And so our lecture has the title, Faith Before the Blessed Man. And Columba, like two or three of the early Celtic missionaries, was called the Blessed Man by various biographies who lived just after their period. So where do we start the story of Christianity in Scotland? And we start, in fact, not in Scotland, not even in Britain, not even in Europe, but we start in North Africa, in the city of Carthage. We start in the year 200, and around that year, a 40-year-old North African in Carthage wrote a book to help fellow Christians. He's called Tertullian, became known to history as a Christian theologian and as a prolific writer. He was a Christian, his wife was also a Christian. We know that because of letters that he wrote to her over a period of time. And Tertullian's books all had the aim of guiding and strengthening the growing Christian church in North Africa. And within the pages of a book that he wrote, round about the year 200, there's a short enigmatic phrase. And Tertullian claims that parts of Britain, inaccessible to the Roman legions, had been conquered for Christ, or subjugated to Christ. And this assertion is made in a chapter in which Tertullian quotes country after country, from the east, from the west, the Roman Empire, which has been accessed by the gospel. The haunts of the Britons, inaccessible to the Roman army, but subjugated to Christ. But what does Tertullian mean by this phrase? To which parts of Britain was he referring? Was he referring to Ireland, which had never been part of the Roman Empire? Was he referring to southwest England, or Cornwall, Devon, which was again in the extremities? Was he referring to southern Scotland, just over Hadrian's Wall? Was he referring perhaps even further north to Pictland? We know that 10 years earlier, Septimus Severus had gone on a voyage right round Britain, and so was Tertullian, reflecting stories which had been brought back. We don't know. So at such an early date as 200, was there any extension of Christian influence into Scotland as we know it today? What does that phrase, haunts of the Britons, inaccessible to the legions, but subjugated to Christ, mean? Were there early Christian communities in what we call Scotland over Hadrian's Wall by the year 200? Now, by itself, that phrase is ambiguous, insufficient. It needs to be supplemented by additional data. Now, we do know that 100 years later, in the early 300s, the Emperor Constantine became the patron of Christianity. And we know that at that time, people all over the empire, including Britain south of Hadrian's Wall, began to adopt Christianity in a general form. And so certainly by the early 300s, Christian growth in Roman Britain accelerated. But did it transfer to Scotland at that early stage? Through military expeditions, through traders, through casual contacts, through intermarriage. What we really want, what we really love to have, are written documents. But we don't have any that tell us clearly. But what we do have are some archaeological indications of early Christian presence in Scotland. Our first archaeological site is the hill known as Traprain Law in East Lothian, east of Edinburgh. And in May of 1919, a man called George Pringle was overseeing some excavation on Traprain Law. He was no stranger to the site. He had assisted the professional archaeologists Alexander Curl and James Cree when they first excavated Traprain before World War I. And then World War I came along, it disturbed the work, it had to close down for 4 years. George Pringle went off to the army, he got wounded, he came back, he recovered, and by 1919 he was working as foreman of the archaeological dig on Traprain Law in East Lothian for Alexander Curl. And on Monday morning, the 12th of May 1919, George Pringle was present at one of the most dramatic discoveries in the whole of Scottish archaeology. Neither of the professionals was on site. James Cree was over at the Atlantic in America on business. Alexander Curl was in Edinburgh. He was director of the National Museum of Antiquities of Scotland. And he used to come each Saturday to see what had been discovered during the week. Then he'd go back to Edinburgh and he'd come back the next Saturday. Well, on the Monday morning, George Pringle was excavating in traditional fashion with his pick. And he disturbed the soil and he was just feeling around with his pick and he felt something hard. So he poked around and he brought out his pick. And hanging from his pick was a silver vessel. A beautiful silver vessel. And round the rim of the vessel was beautifully embossed handiwork, obviously Roman. He knelt on the ground, he removed the soil more with his knife, he worked away at this, and soon they unearthed a pit full of silvery metal objects. And by the end of the afternoon, all the objects were concealed in a hut, and the pit was covered up with soil. Now, George Pringle knew he had to tell the boss. He had to inform Alexander Curl, but of course there's no mobile phone. The nearest phone was at East Linton village, and so one of the men was deputed to go to East Linton and to phone Edinburgh. It was, of course, a public phone box, going through the local operator. And just occasionally the operator stayed online as you made your phone call. So the person who was sent to make the phone call had to avoid words such as treasure, silver, amazing stuff. So the man was sent to East Linton to phone Alexander Curl at the museum in Edinburgh. He made the phone call, and I think the phone call must have gone something like this. Professor, could you come tomorrow? Why? We think it would be interesting. Why? Well, we just think it would be interesting. Are you sure? We think so. Because the next day, the Tuesday, Alexander Curl thought so little about the phone call that he spent all day at the museum, and then late afternoon he decided to motor down to Traprain to see what all the fuss was. So he arrived just after 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and there he was met by an excited Pringle, and he was immediately hurried up the hill. And nothing could have prepared him for what he saw. And what Alexander Curl saw there astounded him. The hole was crammed full. There were scores of items of Roman silverware. There were bowls, there were dishes, there were goblets and coins. There were handles in the form of dolphins and panthers, and some of the articles displayed wonderful Mediterranean designs. And what was striking, that most of them were folded over and cut as if ready to be melted down. And intriguingly and importantly from our perspective, some of the objects were decorated with Christian images and Christian symbols. there were Bible scenes represented on some of the silver which had been dug up at Traprain. An initial examination of the coinage showed that the latest coin had been minted about the year 408, and so the hoard, the treasure, had probably been buried around the years 415 to 420. Now, the Romans never conquered southern Scotland, but there was still a strong Roman presence there. And recent work has shown that the Roman presence in southern Scotland was much stronger than people used to think. The local Votadini had been in contact with the Roman civilization for many years. There had been an accommodation and understanding. But the 1919 discovery was on a level beyond anything that had been thought of before. 25 kilograms of silver was eventually dug up, and you can view most of it in the National Museum in Edinburgh. 150 silver objects. So to whom did this treasure belong? What significance has been read into the presence of Christian symbols inscribed on the silver bowls? Were the objects with Christian markings simply booty from faraway places? That's what Alexander Curl first thought. He thought, well, it's been booty that's been captured maybe hundreds of miles away and brought to Traprain. Or did it mean there was a Christian community of some sort within a short distance of Traprain at the beginning of the 5th century? And that's what more recent thinking about Traprain tends to think was the case. And if so, then silverware with Christian symbols inscribed on them was in the Scottish borders around the year 410. 150 years before Columba comes to Iona. So that's our first archaeological site. When our son-in-law married into the Ritchie family, we informed him that it involved a lot of going to see ancient stones and ancient ruins. That's what we're doing today. Our second archaeological site is in the Yarrow Valley of the Scottish borders. In 1803, a piece of moorland was being ploughed for the first time in order to aid drainage to make it more fertile. And as it was being ploughed in 1803, the plough hit a large stone. And of course the workmen started to upend it, and when they upended it, they found human bones underneath, and they found strange writing on the stone itself. They informed the local landowner, the Duke of Buccleuch, at Bowhill House. He got it dug up, taken to Bowhill House, and he invited several local luminaries along to have a look at it. And among them was Sir Walter Scott, Mungo Park, who became a great explorer missionary in West Africa, and John Leyden from Denham, who became a gifted Oriental language specialist. And they all came to Bowhill House. They had a look at the stone, they tried to decipher the writing, and then after they did that, then very commendably they took the stone back to where they'd found it, re-erected it where it is to this day, where you can go and see it. This stone is now called the Yarrow Stone, understandably being found in the Yarrow Valley in the borders. The inscription on it says, "Here an everlasting memorial in this place, here lie the most famous princes, Nudus and Domingus, in the tomb, two sons of Liberalis." And it's thought that the stone may date from roughly the 5th century, the late 5th century. Now, why is this stone thought to be Christian? Well, similar types of stone have been found in Wales and Cornwall, and these, in conjunction with the type of burial, make a link to Christian influence. Little else is known about these particular people, but they must have been important, high-ranking people of their time, high-status people of their time, possibly members of a family which had been Christian for at least a generation. Again, probably sometime toward the end of the 5th century, the late 400s. That's our second archaeological site. Our next one, apologies for the wee insert there, our next one is called the Cat Stain, and this is in the middle of Edinburgh Airport. So if your plane goes suddenly bump at the end of a runway, you know you've run into the Cat Stain. One of the earliest investigators of the Cat Stain was the Edinburgh scientist James Young Simpson. He was a pioneer of chloroform as an anaesthetic during operations in childbirth, and Simpson also had a very mischievous sense of humour. He loved to host the famous for dinners in his house in Queen Street in Edinburgh. For example, in 1847, Simpson entertained the Danish writer Hans Christian Andersen, the writer of fairy tales. And Hans Christian Andersen, in his biography, describes how James Young Simpson encouraged his visitors to inhale ether. In fact, Hans Christian Andersen was very uncomfortable about this. He wrote in his biography, he said this: "I thought it distasteful, especially to see ladies in this dreamy intoxication. They laughed with open, lifeless eyes. There was something unpleasant about it, and I said so." On another occasion, Simpson sat a slave owner from the southern states of the United States next to someone who'd been a freed slave, and he wanted to see what the reaction would be. But his interests ranged across a wide spectrum. He was one of these wonderful 19th century polymaths. He was one of the first advocates of midwives in Scotland, the office of midwife. He was a stout adherent of the Free Church in its early days, but most of all, he loved to delve into archaeology. In fact, he contributed several papers to the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland, all of which are online and very easily accessible. And one of Simpson's papers for the Society of Antiquaries was on the cat stain, or battle stain as it means. This 4-foot tall stone was inscribed in Latin. It says, "In this tomb lies Vita, daughter of Vitricus." And Vita may have been an important high-status female from the Votadini, and the burial kist, presumably her grave, is at the foot of where the stone is in Edinburgh Airport. Now, Simpson's paper to the Royal Society of Antiquaries of Scotland attracted the attention of another antiquarian, Robert Hutchison, and he did another excavation, and he found a whole lot of burial kists around the Cat Stain area. And these were 51 burial kists. They were in a well-ordered burial ground, and the arrangement was typical of the early Christian period. They were long kists, in other words, the body was laid straight out. They were oriented east-west, which was a traditional Christian way to orient a body in a graveyard, and so they had all the signs of early Christian burial. There's also a lack of funerary vessels buried along with the bodies. In pagan burials, they often put in various vessels for the deceased to take with them in the afterlife. Christians never did that. And so the absence of these vessels is another indicator that this was a Christian burial site. And again, probably mid-5th century or maybe early 5th century. So again, we're thinking of 100 years, 120 years perhaps, before Columba arrives in Scotland in 563. Our fourth archaeological site, we move away from stones to people soon, you'll be glad to know. Our fourth archaeological site comes from southwest Scotland in Galloway. And you may well be thinking, well, this is going to be about Ninian, but not yet, that comes later. Excavations at Whithorn in the 1880s and 1890s resulted in the discovery of the Latinus stone. It's reckoned to be from no later than the year 450, and as such is regarded as Scotland's oldest definite Christian monument. And on the stone in Latin are these words: "We praise you, the Lord, Latinus, descendant of Barabadus, aged 35, and his daughter aged 4, made a sign here. Very clear Christian connections. Firstly, they appeal to the Lord, a clear Christian way of seeing things. And then also, just before, beneath the very top of the stone, there is a Chi-Rho Christian symbol. And indeed, this symbol may be what the word sign is referring to on the actual stone. Now, Chi-Rho, two Greek letters, Chi and Rho, which together have the sound as in the beginning of the word Christ. And so the Chi-Rho symbol, a very ancient symbol. But the particular type of Chi-Rho here is a six-armed Chi-Rho rather than a four-armed one. And according to professional archaeologists, that particular type of Chi-Rho symbol was only used in a very narrow space of years. So that helps to date the stone, the Latinist stone, in Wigton, down in Galloway. So Whithorn, of course, is traditionally associated with St. Ninian, that we're going to think about later. And traditionally, Ninian has been regarded as the earliest named Scottish Christian, but Latinists may predate him, or may not. All depends on when we think Ninian actually lived. And certainly it's evidence of Christians near Whithorn in southwest Scotland as early as the mid-5th century. Now, can we know anything about Latinus himself? Now, clearly a Latinist name is Roman. The Romans left by 410, but the Roman influences stayed on afterwards, so the name Latinus has a Roman root to it. But his ancestor, Baravados, has a local Celtic name. And this points to him being a member of a Romanized British family which had accepted Christian faith. In other words, he came from an indigenous British family which had been integrated into the culture of the Roman Empire, but he was also a Christian. Maybe part of a community which was a spin-off from Christian communities south of Hadrian's Wall in the Carlisle area. That's our archaeology over, you'll be glad to know. So where have we come so far in our story of early Christianity in Scotland? There are probably contacts between the local people in southern Scotland with Christians who came as traders. There may have been contact with Christians who came as soldiers, part of the empire coming across the border. Contact with civilian Christians south of Hadrian's Wall itself. There may even have been Christians south of Hadrian's Wall who actually wanted positively to take the gospel north of the wall to the people who lived there. So a definite spill over into southern Scotland all before 500 AD. And we know that Columba came to Iona in 563. And so we can see that Christian faith has seeped over the border either by traders coming in from the sea, by people coming from land, with also the possibility that there were also people that moved over the Firth of Forth into the southern parts of Fife. James Fraser, Professor of Scottish History, Aberdeen University, he believes that the evidence of Christian faith on the Isle of May in the Firth of Forth are very strong. And he would think you can even find some archaeological evidence on the north shore of the Firth of Forth. Now, James Fraser has his own agenda. He's part of a modern reaction against Columba. He wants to find Christian influences from anywhere other than Iona, almost. And so he's quite concerned to maybe promote these. But certainly, what he writes in his book sounds very persuasive, that not only do we have these evidences we've looked at in southern Scotland, but may even have seeped over the Firth of Forth, Firth of Clyde division into the southern reaches of northern Scotland as well. So put together, what do we have? What seems to be the case is that there were significant Christian influences in southern Scotland in the 5th century, the period from 400 to 500 AD. We're not saying that there were big Christian communities. Neither are we saying that the Christians were part of a formally organised institutional church. We're not saying that. But we are saying that over the border from what had been the official Roman Empire, Christian faith had moved into Scotland enough to leave permanent marks that we can see today. There may have been contact between locals and Christian traders. There may have been contact between locals and Christians in the Roman army. There may even have been Christians from Roman Britain south of Hadrian's Wall who had a burden for souls north of it. That can't be discounted. There may even have been a Christian community in the likes of Cumbria which spilled over the border into Scotland through family connections, etc. Can we put a name to any of the early Christians who operated long before Columba came in 563? Well, there are three names I'd like us to bear in mind. Firstly, Latinus of the Latinus stone in Wigton, we already referred to. Second, Kentigern or Mungo. And third, Ninian of Whithorn. Now, Ninian probably lived before Kentigern, but just to be awkward, we're going to look at Kentigern first. So let's think about Kentigern, or as he is so often called, Mungo. Now, there are some fantastical legends linked to Kentigern's birth. For example, if you read the medieval document, the Aberdeen Breviary, which has a series of prayers for various saints' days in Scotland all through the year, then there are the two extended legends concerning Kentigern. The legend is that his mother was the daughter of a King Loth, who was king near Traprain Law, that we've looked at earlier. And according to the legend, King Loth's daughter Tenu became pregnant outside marriage, and in his fury the king tried to kill his daughter. And first she was tied to a chariot, and the chariot was pushed off over the cliff in Traprain Law, but she survived that. It's a bit like people trying to kill James Bond. Why don't they just shoot him instead of trying all these sophisticated ways? Well, the king tied his daughter to the chariot, pushed it over Traprain Law, it smashed to pieces, but she was okay. That immediately creates a problem because you've tried to execute something. The gods, as they would understand, have spared them, so you can't execute them anymore. So instead, he puts her on a boat, puts her into the Firth of Forth, and leaves it adrift. That's called execution without responsibility. I'm not doing anything, I just put her in the boat, you see. The expectation would be that the boat would sink eventually and she would drown, but instead it drifted over to the north side, according to the legend, to the north side of the River Forth, landed in Fife, and there she found a Christian community run by St. Seraph. She gave birth to a son called Kentigern, later Mungo, who grew up to be a great missionary. Now that legend is given to us at length in the Aberdeen Breviary. And we always have to be careful with legends, but what the legend may be doing is telling us something important about Kentigern's origins. It may be telling us that although his lasting work was going to be in the Glasgow area, that he originally came from the east. And it may be telling us that he came from the east where there had been a small Christian community before he was born. So that may be the core of the historical story behind the legend. We don't know, but we could see that as being a reasonable conclusion. However, when he grew up, when he became a Christian himself, when he went on missionary work, he went from the east over to the Glasgow area and he began to evangelize in the Glasgow area. According to legend, he erected a church where Glasgow Cathedral now stands. For 13 years, he evangelized the Strathclyde area, working from his small cell built on the banks of the Mollendinner Burn, and gained a number of converts. But this is where it gets even more interesting. In the traditional Lives of Kentigern, there is the hint that when he started evangelising around the Clyde, he also was linking up with some Christians who had already been there. Now this is maybe round about the year 540. So it's possible that Kentigern or Mungo's mission was not totally pioneering, but building on an existing base. So where did these earlier Christian influences to Strathclyde come from? The possibility is that they came from Galloway in the south, or maybe also from the east where Kentigern himself had come. Now, Strathclyde was the kingdom of the Britons of Strathclyde, whose headquarters were on Dumbarton Rock, or Auld Clout, as it's known. It would seem to be that when Kentigern first went to the area, that the king of the Strathclyde Britons was friendly towards Christian faith, and then that king died, and a king came in who was hostile to Christian faith, and Kentigern had to leave Scotland. He went down to Wales, according to tradition. When he was in Wales, he maybe did a pilgrimage to Rome, then he came back again. And then that king who was hostile to Christianity, he died, and he was succeeded by King Ridric, who was very much pro-Christian. And because of that, Kentigern was invited to come back up from Wales, continue his work of evangelism. But what does seem clear is that Kentigern came to a Strathclyde area in the early 500s, which had residual Christian influences from more than a century after a previous mission may have evangelised the region. Now, whether that earlier mission had Whithorn roots from Galloway, or Irish roots, or even influences from the east of Scotland, is impossible to assess. Our guess is that a Christian influence developed in Strathclyde, not from Ireland, but from an older British tradition in southern Scotland. And this takes us today to one of the most famous of Columba's predecessors, Ninian of Whithorn in Galloway. Ninian has long been viewed as the first figure in Scotland's Christian heritage, and yet even with him there were almost certainly Christians in Galloway before him. And that when he went to Galloway, when he went to Wigtonshire, when he went to Whithorn, he was going to a community of believers already. Maybe a small community, but one that already existed. But at least, with Ninian, we now have manuscript accounts, we have written accounts, we have clear dates, or at least that's what we used to think. The problem is that Ninian may not be straightforward. His traditional dates are 350 to 423, but modern scholarship questions this. Professor Thomas Clancy of Glasgow has been particularly energetic in rewriting the story of Ninian. You see, our earliest source for Ninian is the great English historian, the Venerable Bede, and Bede, for his own reasons, may have transposed a Ninian who lived later back into an earlier era. Or the Ninian figure may be a doppelganger, a composite figure, made from two or more people with a similar name from elsewhere. And a bit like Columba's. Once you start lifting stones, there's a Columba under every stone. And they're not all the same person. Now we stress that not every contemporary scholar agrees with Thomas Clancy. But his theory is strong enough to be taken seriously. But we're going to look at Ninian mainly from the traditional perspective. And here I'd like us to reflect on the traditional account of Ninian as told by the Venerable Bede in his ecclesiastical history of the English peoples. He wrote a history in 731, 730, and Bede's description of Ninian in Book 3 of his history comes in direct connection with Bede's account of Columba. And that's an important link. Columba died 597, Bede wrote his history 731. Bede wrote The southern Picts who live on this side of the mountains are said to have abandoned the errors of idolatry long before this date, the date being the time of Columba, and accepted the true faith through the preaching of Bishop Ninian, a most reverend and holy man of British race, who had been regularly instructed in the mysteries of the Christian faith in Rome. Ninian's own episcopal see, named after St. Martin of Tours, and famous for its stately church, is now held by the English, Northumbrians, and it is here that his body and those of many saints lie at rest. The place belongs to the province of Bernicia, northern Northumbria, and is commonly known as Candida Casa, the White House, because he built a church of stone which was unusual among the Britons. And in these few lines, Bede gives us the standard Ninian story. But to understand the significance of what Bede writes, we need to know something of the man himself. Bede was known as Bede the Historian, or the Venerable Bede. He was based at the monastery of Jarrow in Northumbria in northern England, and his wonderful history made his reputation. It's wonderful reading. If you haven't read Bede, go and read him. It's lovely bedtime reading. And it's still so good, it's still a priceless mine for modern scholars. Now, when Bede wrote his history in 731, the kingdom of Northumbria had control over southern Scotland, especially in the eastern sector, but also west into Galloway, which included Whithorn. Now, ecclesiastically, Bede was a Rome man. In the Christian world of Bede's day, the huge issue was the competing claims of the Celtic Church on the one hand versus the claims of the Roman Church on the other. Now, in this lecture series, we're talking a little bit about the tension between the Celtic Church and the Roman Church. That is not meant to imply any favouritism one way or the other, okay? We have to look at this. By Bede's time, the most famous Celtic figure had been Columba. Remember, he's writing a century after Columba died. And an Iona-inspired Celtic mission on Lindisfarne had made great inroads in Northumbria during the 7th century. At the same time, a mission sent from Rome, originally under the leadership of Augustine of Canterbury, had steadily worked its way northwards up through England. And these two traditions, the Celtic Church and the Roman Church, had differing structures, they had different forms of authority, they had different Easter observances, they had different religious milieu. The two churches met and collided in Northumbria. And in 664, King Oswy of Northumbria, the Synod of Whitby, declared that his kingdom would henceforth follow the Roman form rather than the Celtic practices. And Bede was a Rome man. And when we read his account of Ninian, we have to bear that in mind. So Bede lived a generation after Whitby. You can see a rough map of the area, the Anglo-Saxons, Northumbria, the Britons, the Scots who were going to come in from the west, and the Picts in the north. Bede was convinced of Rome's way of doing things. And this conviction guides Bede's interpretation of history. And he wrote his history partly to prove that the Rome way of doing things was right, and the Celtic, Iona, Columban way of doing things was wrong. And when we've got this background, we can see that this very innocent paragraph about Ninian, introduced along with Columba, actually has a whole raft of issues attached to it. So if we look closely at what Bede writes about Ninian, what do we see? Firstly, we see he calls him Bishop Ninian. Bede stresses that Ninian was a bishop. For Bede that is important. You see, Columba was only an abbot. In the Celtic Church that didn't matter, but in Bede's church it did. Ninian was a bishop, Columba was just an abbot. He also describes Ninian as a most reverend and holy man of British race. In other words, Bede is emphasising that Ninian comes from an indigenous British tribe. The Columban church was always called the Irish church. And so Bede is saying Ninian was one of us. Okay? He then also goes to say that Ninian was regularly instructed in the mysteries of the Christian faith at Rome, and also when he evangelized, he taught people the true faith. So Bede is keen to portray Ninian as a Rome man through and through. He presents Ninian as a native Briton who studied in Rome. You see, Columba was never in Rome, but Ninian was. And Bede wants to tick off a series of points in which Ninian's mission was superior to Columba's mission. First, he was British, not Irish. Second, he was a bishop, not just an abbot. Third, he was instructed in Rome. And fourth, he operated long before Columba. And the expression regularly instructed means that Ninian was given a proper, comprehensive theological education in Rome. Almost as good as you get at HTC. Similarly, the fact that Ninian was instructed in the mysteries of the Christian faith is meant to imply that Ninian had been instructed in the proper Roman way of observing the mystery of the Easter festival, unlike the Celtic practices. And so in these two significant phrases, Bede stresses Ninian's dependence on Rome and Ninian's conformity to Rome. Bede presents Ninian as a man of the Roman Church. And so he very powerfully establishes Ninian's orthodoxy as viewed from a Roman perspective. Then let's go on. Bede also writes that Ninian built a stately church, Candida Casa, the White House, in Old English Whithorn, from which we get Whithorn. And in Bede's history, an important achievement of Ninian is the erection of a stone church called Candida Casa, the White House. What else does Bede say about Candida Casa? He says it's built of stone and not of wattle, as customary among the Britons and the Celtic saints. Usually built their churches of wood. Now, what significance is there in stressing that? Stone indicates the building was not in the Celtic form. It also indicates it was meant to be permanent. It also indicates that from Ninian's time till the present day, as far as Bede is concerned, the church, Ninian's church, has been in that area. Continuity. In other words, Columba may have come in the interim, but Ninian was first and Ninian's work continues. And that's a big point that Bede's making. And this comes out right at the very beginning, where he says, the southern Picts who live on this side of the mountain are said to have abandoned the errors of idolatry long before this date. By date, he means the time of Columba. Bede's employment of the words long before this date mean long before Columba and are deliberate. Bede wants to show that the work of the Roman educated and commissioned Ninian predate any mission by the Celtic Church to what we now know as Scotland, especially Pictland. In the culture of Bede's era, precedence of activity was a powerful argument for primacy of claim. Precedence of activity is a powerful argument for primacy of claim. Hence, being able to point to Ninian, who operated long before Columba had operated, was immensely relevant. And in Bede's mind, Ninian's mission trumped the claim of the Celtic Church to be the first ambassadors of the gospel to Pictland. It's because this is so important for Bede that some scholars, such as Tom Clancy, who reckon Bede played fast and loose with some of his data, speculate this is perhaps why he moved Ninian from a later date to an earlier date, in order to be prior to Columba, and in order to say, well, our man worked among the Picts long before the Irish Celtic Columbans did. So that lovely section in Bede it's got so much in it, so much in it there. Now, one of the puzzling phrases in Bede's extract is this phrase, the Southern Picts. He implies that Ninian evangelized the Southern Picts just a couple of minutes to go. And his point, of course, is that long before Columba evangelized the Northern Picts, Ninian was already an apostle to the Southern Picts. Now, remember, in Bede's day, precedence of activity proves priority of claim. Bede is arguing that Ninian worked among the Picts before Columba did, and because Ninian was a Rome man, not an Iona man, then the Roman Church has the right to be the church of the whole of Britain, including Pictland. But did Ninian ever, in fact, evangelize the Picts? Who are these Southern Picts? To which part of Scotland did Bede think they belonged? Excuse the map of the mountains here. Remember, he says that Ninian evangelized this side of the mountains. Does he mean Dramalba that goes up and down the west of Scotland? Does he mean that the Grampians, the Cairngorms, south of the Mouth? Does he mean the Galloway Hills? We don't know. So what does he mean by over the mountains, this side of the mountains? And there's two ways people have interpreted what Bede says that Ninian evangelized the Southern Picts. Some people say that what he is meaning is in section 1, Galloway. If that's what he means, certainly no modern scholar would ever say that there were Picts there. There were Britons there, but not Picts. But of course, Bede didn't have our atlases, our historical atlases. The other possibility is that by this side of the mountains he evangelized the Southern Picts. He was meaning section 2, going through Perthshire up towards Aberdeen. Now we know that there are very early inscriptions and dedications to Ninian in that area, even going as far up as Shetland, St Ninian's Isle. Now that does not necessarily mean that Ninian went there. It may have been his followers or people in his tradition. But there may be the possibility that evangelists from Whithorn did go up into southern Pictland as in section 2, or it may be that they only operated in section 1. We don't know. But what we see in Bede, and we'll come back to Bede again in our series, is that he has an agenda. And then our main biographer of Columba, Adomnan, also has an agenda. And it's when we understand the thinking behind both biographers that some of the really interesting factors come into play. But what do we have by this period? The Christian map of Scotland rounded at the year 500. We have southern Scotland, which has had Christian influences. Whithorn, elsewhere. We have a possible Whithorn mission northwards into central Scotland, perhaps even further up, we don't know. We have the kingdom of Strathclyde, which has declared itself to be a Christian nation. One of the frustrating things in Scottish history, we have absolutely no documentation from this wonderful kingdom of Strathclyde. We have to read it from elsewhere. We have possible communities north of the Four Clyde, but we also have, just off the side, in Ireland, massing, like rugby supporters ready to go into Murrayfield, a whole host of eager Irish Celtic missionaries ready to invade the West Coast. And with them will come Columba.